today is that first day of the fall semester here at Columbia University. However, the university appears to be taking security steps to make sure that people who do not belong on campus do not get on campus.
So colleges across New York are back in session, but something looks different about them. Because instead of a beautiful environment out of a campus brochure, you'll see crowd control barriers and security guards checking ID. And that's because fall no longer marks the start of football season. It's also the start of another season of protests.
This is exactly what Columbia officials did not want after encampments grew on campus last year, and it all culminated in protesters taking over an academic building, as you see there.
Protesters outside campus also once again clashing with police.
Everybody, I think, deserves to have their voice heard, and everybody deserves to feel safe on a campus.
They're all outside, so, they want to kick it outside, that's fine.
I don't think people are particularly happy about this, and it's still very divided, I think.
Just a block from Columbia University, over 100 pro-Israeli demonstrators urging American colleges to ban face coverings during protests.
They want to make us feel unsafe, afraid, and targeted simply because of our Jewish identity.
This comes after the spring protests at Columbia, where some pro-Palestinian demonstrators covered their faces and taunted Jewish students.
What's going on in Gaza and the West Bank must stop. It's going on too long.
I'm Palestinian myself, and just watching every single day, it's hard to go to sleep imagining it.
So a 40-year-old man was just indicted for flag burning at Columbia's protests last spring. But what everyone's missing is that these colleges, many of them, have been ramping up security all summer long in anticipation of the fall semester, revealing that universities now feature protesting as an extracurricular activity, much to the chagrin of college administrators throughout New York and the country. And although the continuation of campus protests serve to remind the world of the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Palestine and how that conflict needs to end, the challenge now is for New York-based colleges to keep their campuses from spiraling out of control. Because these protests caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages to Columbia's historic campus. Plus, it cost the taxpayers of New York hundreds of thousands in police overtime spending after the university begged the cops to step in and restore order. But remember, these not-so-peaceful protests, they didn't just happen at Columbia. In fact, many of the schools here in New York were affected by them. NYU experienced large gatherings and erected barriers, and the new school even saw teachers and students camping out in tents on campus for over a week. Not exactly something that helps attract students whose main concern is education, not activism. But it gets worse because many of the protesters still feel emboldened by the support they received from faculty at many of these colleges, who, in addition to camping out on campus with students, also issued statements in support of the protesters and bashed the very universities who employ them for their alleged support of Israel. Which brings us to the real reason why many of our college campuses are now on lockdown. There's a battle going on in the minds of everybody, students and faculty alike, concerning a conflict taking place half a world away. And on a daily basis, simmering tensions over the conflict in Palestine threaten to boil over and create chaos once again, because these colleges still haven't acquiesced to the demands of the protesters by canceling their investments in Israeli businesses, as doing so could cost them money and would effectively reward the protesters for taking over their campuses last spring, which observers say these protesters are aiming to do again the first chance they get, which is why school administrators at every single one of our campuses are waiting to see what will happen next. So here we are at New York University, and just like Columbia, there is a security apparatus on site. It's not what it is at Columbia, where things are arguably to a much higher degree with ID checkers, gates at pretty much every single entrance. That looks like a TSA checkpoint, but this, it looks like they're ready for something to happen in case it does. Just like it did at Columbia on the very first day of school.
And the fall semester at Columbia starting the same way the spring semester ended, with protests.
Yeah, what appears to be maybe a couple dozen pro-Palestinian protesters are marching right outside the entrance to the campus. The NYPD has set up barriers.
So the protesters, as you can see, they're back. Yes, it was just a small number of them, but there were clashes with police on day one. And the school was definitely well prepared. There are barricades up there right now. The entire area is walled off, and you can't even get on campus unless you show an ID at one of the checkpoints. But this is an absolute nightmare for that school, this school, any school in the city. Everyone was hoping that these protests had ended at the end of last year, but they're continuing right now in the fall. But that's because they're meant to bring awareness to a humanitarian crisis that is still not over and needs to end as soon as possible. But Columbia is not the only place that experienced a recent protest. One campus in Midtown was just hit with protests, which actually ended up taking place at a deli near the school where students were having lunch. Protesters confronted them and apparently berated them, which is kind of the opposite of the inclusive behavior colleges are supposed to be encouraging, especially when everyone involved is attending the same school, paying the same tuition, may even have the same major, and live in the same country. Yet people see themselves as enemies and part of a conflict that's happening on the other side of the globe. Not that it's not important, it is, but critics say sometimes these protests go a bit too far. And that's why many of our campuses now have these TSA-style checkpoints all over the place.
Take a look. Students are filing through the front gate showing ID with many NYPD officers and campus security in place. Just up the block here at 116th and Broadway, a relatively small group of vocal yet peaceful pro-Palestinian protesters. This all started coming together.
So while NYU is obviously ready to seal off its campus borders once again if necessary, that has already happened up at Columbia, which means you can't just show up and wander around because you intend on spending $70,000 to visit Columbia next semester. And every visitor is now logged in needs express permission just to get inside. And that's because things are such a mess up there that the president of the college resigned a month ago. At Columbia, you had protesters who broke into one of the buildings on campus and occupied it for almost 2 weeks. And after about a week of negotiating with the protesters and getting nowhere, the school begged the NYPD to come in and remove all of the students. And of course, there was controversy about how gentle or not gentle the police were when they made those removals. However, none of that has deterred the overall idea of protesting to bring awareness to this crisis happening in Palestine right now. But the only problem with that is if these protests become less than peaceful, will Columbia and other schools like NYU be able to honor their promise to provide a safe learning environment to every single student? That's something that not everyone thinks is the case.
I spoke with 2 students a short time ago, a freshman and a senior.
I had early decision last year, so I already knew that I was coming here even before it got really bad, but seeing what happened just made me know that I needed to be here and needed to show that we're not gonna just sit down and...
So this is very interesting. Now, at some of these schools, you have some students who intend to go there because of recent protest activity. That's not the entire student body, but this means that the school is now going to have to carry out the same responsibilities it has to everybody while allowing people to come there and do what they want to do by expressing themselves. This is going to make it hard for many colleges to keep peace within their walls, especially when you have a diverse campus with teachers and students of varying backgrounds in the same place at the exact same time, revealing that on many campuses, a big free speech battle is about to take place, and now students are worried whether or not their administrators will take the side of the viewpoints that oppose them, which shouldn't happen. These schools should be run by a neutral body. However, many students, they're upset that the nature of their school has changed. People that signed up for Columbia or NYU a couple of years ago, now they come here and there's all this security, they're not necessarily thrilled with it.
I don't think people are particularly happy about this, and it's still very divided, I think.
What needs to happen?
I think more listening to the students. I think there's not enough student engagement with these new rules.
Can you imagine you're going to one of these schools and maybe you're in your second year or maybe this is your graduation year. You've already got some time here under your belt and then the whole place changes and becomes a security apparatus. You're just going to have to put up with it because dropping out or transferring is just going to cost more money, waste time, and be more work than finishing your degree. And on the other hand, prospective students that maybe a couple of years ago thought they were coming to Columbia or NYU might end up changing their minds when they see how these places are now being run. Now look, is the degree the same? Is the education the same? Probably. That probably doesn't change. But these colleges, they market themselves as being places that provide an experience that is special and unique and is wonderful, and this somewhat conflicts with that. But there are new laws on the table in New York that might change a lot of what we're seeing around us right now. Many college administrators are probably hoping that these things become a reality, but at the same time, activist groups say that they are very controversial because they might stifle student rights and lead to people getting arrested when they show up at protests that remain peaceful. And peaceful protesting is something that many of these universities say they support. So here we are in Washington Square Park, right down the street from NYU. In fact, their campus surrounds this location, and one of the concerns that many people have is that protest activity will continue to spill from our campuses into our streets or vice versa. And there are two ideas on the books right now from lawmakers to kind of get a handle on this before it gets out of control. And they both have to do with the idea of denying people the ability to mask up at a protest. You can still protest, just you can't wear a mask.
Just a block from Columbia University, over 100 pro-Israeli demonstrators urging American colleges to ban face coverings during protests.
They want to make us feel unsafe, afraid, and targeted simply because of our Jewish identity.
This comes after the spring.
So one of these ideas is to make it a law that you can't wear a mask at a protest in New York. A statewide law, not just a law at one particular county outside of New York City. And the other idea is that school administrators will have some sort of mask ban as far as protests on their campuses. And the idea behind this is that when people cover their faces, perhaps they become emboldened to do things that are no longer peaceful, which, if you know your American history, is something that masked hate groups have been known to do in the past. For example, if someone wanted to deface a well-known public monument here in New York, they might think that concealing their identity before engaging in vandalism would protect their personal life from any consequences. And the idea here is that if screaming violent lunatics have to take their face coverings down, they will not be screaming violent lunatics intent on destroying property that's been here for a long time. But what most people don't know is that in New York, there was a mask ban in place for a very long time, which was repealed in 2020. And if this ban were reinstituted, it would just be the reenactment of laws that were here for quite some time that nobody had a problem with, which now people do for some reason, even though exceptions would be made for personal health reasons.
The American Civil Liberties Union says it gives police the power to stop someone, almost like stop and frisk in New York City.
Masks not only protect people's health, but they also permit people to engage in protected First Amendment activity.
On Sunday around 8 p.m., officers stopped this man.
So there's this idea that free speech is threatened if a person has to reveal their identity. And that makes sense if you have a viewpoint which could result in your personal persecution, maybe a loss of your job, because you were spotted voicing your opinion for something you believe in, which is your constitutional right. Yet the last thing the city wants is for hateful individuals to disguise themselves, protest, create havoc, and then go back to living a normal life. That's almost like having a guerrilla army full of protesters lurking in your city, which also has a lot to do with why the ID checks are happening at places like Columbia. And that has to do with the prevalence of non-student agitators attending some of these protests. Like this gentleman here broke into a Columbia University building and caused damage to the campus without being a student there. And incidents like this have people wondering just how many of the protesters at these college campuses were legitimate students and how many were agitators who showed up there to cause havoc and bounced around from protest to protest on various campuses throughout the city. One thing we do know is that there were protesters who would leave one campus where they were a student and then follow that protest to another campus where they weren't a student, which means that many of these protests could have involved the same people and would likely have been smaller if access were limited to those campuses to just students. So that's a big component in this as well. But you see all of these police barricades throughout the city, all over the place. These remind us that it is the NYPD who is ultimately responsible for quelling societal unrest and upheaval when it happens, as they did at Columbia last spring. But there's a problem. The NYPD may not be up to the task this year, even though it's only been a few months since the last protests.
Hundreds of people from all over the tri-state area gathered in Union Square around noon. Among the messages, calling on the U.S. to halt funding to Israel.
I believe in this. What's going on in Gaza and the West Bank must stop.
So that right here, that was a massive protest which rolled through Union Square, which is just north of here. Now, it remained peaceful, but a protest of that size, that was like 5,000 people, and the NYPD has to be ready in case that crowd decides to spiral out of control for some reason. When you have that many people in one place, public safety is an issue. The protection of property, of businesses and homes is an issue. And when you realize that the main issue that the protesters are concerned with, the investment of the U.S. government and various colleges and universities into Israeli businesses and their economy, that issue hasn't gone away anytime soon. It likely won't in the near future, which means these protests are going to keep happening. And you know what else is going to keep happening? The need for a sudden large police response. But that comes at a very bad time for our city because we've got crime waves going on all over town. At the beginning of this year, we had a crime wave in our subway system, which was averaging 6 felonies a day. 1,000 police officers were sent in there with the National Guard to stamp it out. which they did, but that left other gaps in our city as far as law enforcement goes, and there wound up being crime waves at local restaurants targeting diners and at Central Park. And with so many issues facing the short-staffed NYPD as it is, more issues that pop up might be too much for their shrinking force. In fact, on average, the NYPD loses around 200 officers every single month, and over the last few years, more officers have left the department than have entered it, and it looks like future NYPD headcounts will be even lower than they are today. We're going to have the fewest police we've had in a long time very soon. Which raises a big question. If there are protests at various campuses in New York City, how much of that responsibility should fall on the NYPD if these colleges aren't doing everything they can to secure their campuses and maintain peace ahead of time? And there are many who say that the disaster that unfolded at Columbia last spring never would have happened if the school administrators hadn't allowed protesters to occupy a building and camp out there for over a week while they negotiated with them. Those negotiations fell apart. The police had to come in, and it cost the city hundreds of thousands of dollars in overtime, and it diverted police resources from other areas of town where they have a responsibility to keeping people safe. What do you think could be done to keep people safe on college campuses? Are these colleges doing enough? Let me know. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.